Hello and welcome. Tonight we're speaking about Community Choice Aggregation. With me is Paul Fenn, the founder and director of Local Power. Paul, thanks for coming.
It's a pleasure to see you again, Tom.
Good to see you.
Thanks for having me on.
All right. So let's start by talking a bit about Local Power and Community Choice Aggregation.
Well, it's a funny story, really. I back in graduate school in the early 90s was studying the actually worker nosification and in graduate school at the University of Chicago, and got really focused on the idea of the encirclement of nature as a sort of, I guess, as a natural phenomenon, which is globalization, the separation of all land into exploitation zones and protected zones, so parks and industrial areas, sacrifice areas. And I became really interested in carbon trading, the emergence of emissions credit trading, which led to cap and trade today, as a form of encirclement, right? That as a form of essentially of sacrifice, sacrificing the atmosphere in this case, and in particular,
commodifying it.
Exactly.
Yes.
And the irony of treating the auctioning or the trading of atmosphere as a solution to climate change, when in fact climate change was caused by, from my view, an excess of trading and commoditization. So I became really interested in this, and it just so happened that the author of emissions credit trading theory was at Chicago at the time. In fact, he's still there, Ronald Coase, who was subsequently got the Nobel Prize in economics for work that he'd done in the 50s that led to cap and trade. So I called the guy up thinking, it was a bit of a lark actually. A friend of mine was one of his students, and I called him up thinking he'd hang up on me and that'd be the end of it. I told him that his theory reminded me of the nightmare of these Hungarian communists I'd been reading, Georg Lukács, who wrote about the History and Class Consciousness, the book which put forward the theory of so-called commodification, I think is the term that he used. And essentially was a theory trying to explain the failure of class consciousness. And in some ways it's related to Tom Frank's book, What's the Matter with Kansas? This phenomenon, it's arguably an epiphenomenon of why is it that this nation of largely poor people who have no hope to rise, nevertheless worship the emperor, worship the power of the emperor, vote for every war, vote for policies that exploit them. And it is a very exhaustively studied problem of what is the matter with these people? Why can't they see it in their best interest?
Do you think Frank hit it in his book? It was pretty good.
It was very good, but I think there's something missing there.
Yes.
And ultimately I was sort of trying to study it in graduate school and was focusing on essentially the relationship between the intellectual and the so-called common man, a very awkward relationship. And I studied in particular the Social Democratic Party in Germany, and the crisis of the Second International prior to World War I, which is when worker nosification first really hit the street, so to speak, and specifically the marginalization of all of the old Marxist intellectuals from the Socialist Party in Germany, the so-called Bernstein-Luxemburg debate, which was when the Spartacists and essentially the dialectical materialists, the theoreticians of the party, who were also the grandsons and grandnephews of Karl Marx, were all expelled from the party and shortly thereafter were murdered by workers, ironically.
By workers.
By workers. And of course they're fascists, but they're also workers. And so this is the irony, and we live with this irony today in the form of the so-called liberal elite, right? Or the limousine liberal. You hear these various expressions of how liberals are elitist. This apperception on the part of if you want to call it middle America, or of resentment toward the intellectual, and particularly toward intellectuals who are concerned with the protection of the poor. So for me, that's a real focal point. And community choice.
It's a real trick. It's just such a real psychological trick to turn people against their own interests that way.
Yes, it is.
Well, one thing Frank talked about is taking economics out of the equation. They somehow taking economics out of the equation so that freedom to these neoliberals means, gee, I'm the same as you, and and we all have the same opportunities, and no one's complaining, and no one's looking for a handout, and everyone's got their sleeves rolled up, and they're doing the best they can.
Yeah.
And if you made it big, you must be really smart. And
right.
That's appealing to a farmer in Kansas, I think, on a very visceral level.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's true. That being said, if you've read the work of Christopher Lasch, who's been dead now some 15 years, I guess, 10 years, he wrote a lot about the same problem inside of Marxism, trying to find a problem in Marxism, essentially. And I do believe there was a problem in Marxism, which he did. And that was the waiting game of dialectical materialism. Well, it's admittedly a strange path to an energy policy, but you asked me, what was the origin, and it strangely came out of this. I had not followed the work of Christopher Lasch at the time, but I came back later and found it and thought it was just really very, very correct. Walter Benjamin wrote about this too. It was the problem of the theory of class consciousness within Marx, essentially, which failed, and that was, in a sense, the result of the theory of economic concentration and centralization. And so you had, back in the 1880s and 1890s, among these Marxists who ran the German party and its rise to power, which it did. It went from a marginal party that was illegal and banned by the imperial government, to being the majority party in parliament in about 15 years. And once they got to power, this crisis really occurred. Why? Because they had parliamentary power. They were exercising it, and they were put in this ironic position of essentially calling for revolutionary policies within the platform of the party, while in practice they were seeking improved conditions for the workers, and there was socialized medicine and so on. In other words, reformist policies. And so it put them on the spot, and it complicated their ability to be theoretically coherent in their practices.
This focus on centralization, now, was that the wrong path taken, it seems?
Well,
obviously the USSR was a massively centralized state, and there's debate over whether that was ever socialism or whether we called it that for our reasons and they called it that for their own reasons. But not to interrupt you, but it just seems to me that it's a good way to circle it back to local power. No,
I think that's right. It's in a sense, the distinctions between the Soviet Union and the United States have been really diluted, during the last 100 years. And what joined them together is that both became imperialist, both became statist, highly centralized, and in the process lost all of their idealism, in effect, could no longer afford idealism. I really got focused in the withdrawal in the emergence of worker Nazism, and this phenomenon of the reactionary, the Archie Bunker, the reactionary worker, the withdrawal of radical theory into negative critique. And so, this of course occurred within the deconstruction movement, and has dominated cultural criticism in the last quarter century, longer, really, the last half century. Ideas of resistance, resistance theory. So I was studying resistance theory at the University of Chicago, and became really quite disillusioned with it. I felt it to be essentially a kind of regressive position in reaction to the reactionary worker. And that there was a failure, I think, in that criticism and that negative critique to engage in the complex, and a withdrawal into a kind of purity or a purism. and ultimately a kind of naivete, which refused to accept the increasing complexity of economic questions, of technological questions, of cultural questions, partly because of imperialism, but partly because of the effects of the Enlightenment, of this extraordinary proliferation of knowledge, technology, and human power.
Well, all the impetus was against localization. What you're talking about is relocalization.
Yes.
So let's talk about relocalization.
Okay. I mean, the core action for me at the time was something I called positive dialectics. And I've ended up writing a bunch of pieces called positive dialectics. And the idea was, reacting to the theory of negative dialectics by Theodor Adorno. Now, his view and the view of the Frankfurt School back in, after the war when they came to New York and then Los Angeles was that essentially Hitler had won the war. And that Walt Disney exemplified the victory of Hitler. And that the American culture, which was mass culture, was essentially fascist. And that essentially, in his view, the view of negative dialectics, that we were facing a dark age, that we were now, that the Enlightenment and both the secular tradition of the Enlightenment, but also the actual knowledge that the Enlightenment produced. I'm talking about the Scottish, English, Northern European Enlightenment that led to the English Revolution, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the German Revolution, the end of emancipation of the serfs, etc., that this was all about to be forgotten. And so, in effect, negative dialectics was a strategy for left intellectuals facing a dark age to essentially maintain the memory of the Enlightenment through the dark age. It's a very pessimistic view. And so, anyway, I wrote my master's thesis at Chicago, a thing called positive dialectics. And the basic premise was that this whole withdrawal from the presence of the worker, the fascist worker, into a critique explaining the worker's fascism, essentially was a part of the failure, that there had to be a re-engagement of that fascism. So I was trying to basically study efforts to re-engage fascists, that was, in other words, trade union workers who were racist. Okay, this is a huge problem in all labor history, including right now. The labor unions in San Francisco today are white guys from Concord who are making sure they get the jobs and not the local people in the community. It's a terrible sort of disease of the trade union movement.
Well, they never liked the hippies very much either.
No, they didn't.
No.
And this sort of culture effectively war or détente, I've thought is part of the problem. And so, I basically wanted to come up with this. I thought, okay, well, the problem ultimately is critique itself. So what does that mean? I thought, well, essentially it means a kind of change of locution, that writing itself and language itself has lost its power in political discourse. And that in order to re-empower discourse, that the practice of writing should change from a critique into what I thought at the time was the writing of law. So I'm going to write a law. I got this idea in my head, a grand old age of 24, whatever it was. I'm going to write a law. I had no idea what the law should be, but I thought the law would essentially, if it were to implement positive dialectics, it would not critique, but instead it would compete. It would actually attempt to supplant a capitalist, purely market-based policy in some way. I didn't know what policy. That's how I eventually got around to Ronald Coase, because he had written this policy ostensibly to reduce greenhouse gas emissions worldwide through a trading principle, the creation of a commodity, that the commodity would replace state power and essentially would effectuate the goals of the state in itself as a kind of almost magical collective activity. Yeah. I thought, this is what I want to beat. Right? This is what I think is ultimately evil, contrary to its own purpose.
So you had your meme, he had his meme.
He had his meme.
But if you're going to start a meme, it has to be empowered. There's lots of memes out there, but some of them, don't really get traction.
It was.
But
I had no idea.
Yeah.
All I had was, okay, he's creating these commodities that can be traded by corporations. So what would the alternative be? When I called Coase, to his credit, he was a great old scholar, in effect, and he instead of being offended, he encouraged me and said, you're right. He didn't like his own theories anymore. He resented being co-opted by Milton and Friedman and the Chicago School, and he said that he thought carbon trading would actually fail. and he compared emissions credits to the Russian stock market. He said, how can you trade stock when you don't have enforceable contracts, when there's too much chaos and there's too much fraud in the system? You can't establish the value in any kind of rational way.
There's too much opportunity for fraud, and as opposed to just a flat tax, something simple. It could be implemented immediately. There isn't a lot of gray area, but when you have a situation of this carbon trading, there's all sorts of gray areas and opportunities for brokers and opportunities for not just middlemen, but the politicians, get their hands in it too.
I mean, when you're planting a tree somewhere and you're claiming a credit, what happens to that tree 5 years from now? Is it still there? Well, they claim the credit, and for the life of the tree, and they traded the credit. So
they want to make it abstract.
Yes.
If it's abstract enough, then you can have all kinds of wheeling and dealing going on.
Yeah.
And of course, if it's abstract, I don't have to look at you and cheat you. I can cheat you from another city.
Yeah, it becomes a cheater's game in effect.
Yes.
So I apologize for delaying the answer to your question, but it was several steps for me along the way. And so I thought, well, when I talked to Coase, he said, if you really want to get into this, I don't know how he knew, obviously he'd been tracking it his whole life, but he said, electric industry restructure is coming to the United States. It's being brought here by Margaret Thatcher from the United Kingdom, and it's going to be the big thing. And
you had not been focused on electric?
Not at all.
Yeah.
I thought PG&E was a government agency. I mean, I grew up here in Oakland, Berkeley, so
right.
I always thought PG&E, are they, like most people do, aren't they public utility?
Right.
So I didn't know anything about it, and but he said first it'll come to Massachusetts and then California. Of course, I was from California. My wife's from Massachusetts, and I thought, well, that must be it. So I left the University of Chicago after getting a master's degree and spent a year temping while trying to get a job in the Massachusetts legislature, and I got a job as the chairman of the Energy Committee, and I wrote this bill. Basically, it was just very simple principles. Okay, Ronald Coase wants to have global trading of commodities. What would the alternative be? Well, let's use local government. It's the opposite of a global system, local government, and put them in between the energy suppliers and the people. But serve all of the alleged goals that Margaret Thatcher's policy would serve. She would claim that electric industry deregulation, which came to California just after that and was very much the British model, was adopted here in California, which would just basically deregulate and sell off power plants that were under the state's control to entities that were not under the state's control, and then create a legal condition of choice for customers in which customers had the legal right to buy power. And so I thought, well, a community buying power would get a better deal for smaller customers. So Thatcher's policy might help Jack in the Box or LA Stadium or some huge corporation that has 20 campuses all over the U.S. and a huge energy budget. They can go out and find a supply, but what about the small businesses, and what about the residential? But they won't get anything.
What about a renter?
Exactly.
That wants to put solar on his roof.
Exactly. So what about them? So the idea was to put the government in between, and then to give them the authority to aggregate the accounts, that is basically represent the demand of the community, and then control the negotiation and selection of the supplier. That was the first step. So I wrote this bill in the Senate, and for me, I was such a sort of intellectual, really, that it never occurred to me the bill would actually pass. I wrote the bill thinking of the action of the writing of the bill as an innovation in the practice of history, and that is in effect what I called a participatory history, which would re-empower language in the interpretation of these events. So I thought it would cause a lot of sort of light upon the subject, and really never thought of it as something that would actually pass. But then, as these things happen in life, I got sucked into it and managed to persuade some local people in Cape Cod that it was a good idea for purposes of climate change. And that was really the second, apart from saying this would be better for little people, what I said was, if municipalities could control the energy supply so easily, just through an action of an ordinance, which is this requires, not some kind of huge takeover where they destroy the utility and go to court for 20 years and issue $5 billion of bonds and go through all this pain, but just pass an ordinance and it's done. This could enable cities to essentially force climate protection into a simple public policy because electricity is the largest single cause of greenhouse gas emissions in the world. So that's where I kind of got a footing with the people down in Woods Hole from the old New Alchemy movement. There's actually some folks down there who...
What year is this?
This is 1993,
Oh.
so over 20 years ago.
Did the words community choice aggregation come into play at that time?
No, it took me a while to name it.
Yeah.
First I called it the competitive electricity franchise, basically saying we're reinventing the franchise. And after a while, I started learning, right? I mean, first wrote the bill, then the bill passed, and then Cape Cod formed a community choice aggregation. They just called it a municipal aggregation at the time, something like that. And immediately the utilities reacted by getting approval from state regulators to shift costs in their distribution rates to harm the economics of the Cape Light Compact. And so I learned a lesson there, which was, the incumbent corporation has recourse. So we create this structure, it's implemented, and then they make this other move in another part of the state that if state regulations that can essentially block the formation of more of these entities.
So it's more of a chess game than...
Oh yeah. At that point, I started thinking about HBonds because I started thinking we've got to get out of buying. Part of the problem with the original model was cities buying power for their communities. It's not enough to buy. And that is what I really learned from utility opposition was they can screw up the market so that the economics don't work for buying. That is an option for the energy industry. They're able to manipulate the market to cause that effect. So how do you get out of it? The answer for me was build renewable supply locally inside the substations and behind the meters where the transmission distribution charges are imposed by the state regulators. So if you go behind the meter, they can't impose the charge because the charges are volumetric, right? They only charge you a surcharge on every kilowatt hour you buy. So if you don't buy the kilowatt hour, you don't have to pay the surcharge. But if you're generating the power and you can finance it effectively on the bill, you're still getting power, but you're not paying the surcharge. These surcharges are in 10 to 30% range. They're huge charges, multi-billion-dollar charges. So I started sort of rebuilding this model around how essentially to bypass the utility. We called it bypass, and we ended up calling everything we did utility bypass mechanisms. And how do you get out of this essentially reservation? It's an energy reservation that we live in, a monopoly in which legal or non-legal, in which technology has been stifled for decades. And climate change has been caused by the action of the stifling of these technologies. So, the more I got into it, the more I realized, wow, this is, number one, this is real. Number two, it's gone up to 6 states now. It's 25% of the United States, and there are 800 CCAs now, and it's city of Chicago is going to do it next year. San Francisco is now officially going ahead. Sonoma County, Cincinnati just started service.
And you were very involved in San Francisco.
In San Francisco, we're particularly involved. Yeah, that's sort of where I made my kind of created all the original molds for this stuff. Was for the
Right.
city where I had Tom Ammiano sort of supporting this idea from the late 90s, from 1998. And so he provided me with the authority to start to push specific things, including the so-called HBond authority, which is a revenue bond authority charter amendment that I wrote in 2001 and voters approved. And that's been a part of the Community Choice program in the city since then. So we're now finishing a preparation of an energy model and a financial model for the city's energy localization, which will use the group buying power of the whole city, $350 million per year, and will issue revenue bonds, same way bonds are issued to build bridges or hospitals or parking garages. Will issue revenue bonds and will finance the construction of a replacement of the power supply of the city. At the same time, offering financing to residents and businesses to own their power supply. So basically changing it into this sort of third option model where it isn't either the corporation owns the supply or the government owns the supply, but instead a third option where you own your supply. And the grid effectively becomes a backup to your supply rather than the supply itself. And so we're just finishing that. They've the draft financial model, I'm going to give that to them very soon. And we're supposed to draft and issue RFPs, or these are requests for proposals or solicitation documents for the construction of the supply in March 2013.
Well, Paul, we're almost out of time. You'll have to come back and tell us. I understand PG&E's, you're finding that these utilities have all sorts of clever ways to counter-maneuver the things that you're trying to do. And on your blog, there's some really interesting information about these lobbying efforts.
Yeah, if people are interested, it's powergrab.info is a daily news site where we track all of the community choice aggregations around the country. We also track a lot of global energy news and energy-related war on the site. And I also have a blog which specifically covers California, but also Illinois has 250 cities now doing it. So yeah, thank you.
Well, Paul Fenn of Local Power, thank you for coming.
It's a pleasure, Tom.
You're always welcome here.
Thanks so much.
All right,
Pleasure.
good
Anytime.
to talk to you.
Anytime.
All right. And thank you for watching. Good night.